Hey everyone, Boulevard here, a caster, master rank player, tournament analyst. This week things are going to be a little bit different. So typically we'd be heading into Duels of Runeterra 11, and I'd have a lot of great info to show you guys. Instead, Duels of Runeterra canceled their North America and European events in solidarity with the Runeterra for Change tournament. Now, it's an absolutely great tournament. It's a great cause. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to be playing in it myself. The difference is this is a no card overlap tournament as opposed to a region lock tournament. So a lot of the data that I've kind of thrown at you for the last week, actually remains relatively the same, luckily for us. A little bit of it goes out the window, but there was a tournament last weekend called BR Fest that did do a no-card overlap tournament. So I do actually have some data as well as the invitational that they did today, Friday, which is why this one is coming out so late. The invitational is still going on at the time of recording, so I don't know who won, but I'll get into that a little bit later. Overall, the tournament format is relatively the same in terms of what's good, and I'm going to show you guys what's new, what decks have popped up on ladder that we haven't seen in tournament yet, what did we see in the BR Fest that we didn't see in any of the smaller tournaments from last weekend, like the Good Day Maverick tournament, and what do lineups look like going into this weekend. Don't worry guys, I am absolutely here to guide you through this process. You're going to do great this weekend. So in a no-card overlap format, decks that are mostly one region with a small splash of another tend to be a lot more popular, and with Endure Spiders making a big ladder resurgence, it's certainly going to be one of the more popular decks this weekend. The only Freljord card it really needs is They Who Endure, the rest is flavor depending on what you do or don't run in your other Freljord decks, and this deck is a lot more aggressive and combo based than it's been in the past, with nearly all players switching over to Callista, as well as putting in things like Ravenous Butcher to take advantage of the weaker early games of the more popular decks, and we've even seen Ancient Crocolith appearing in some of the lists to lean into this strategy a little bit harder. The problem with Endure Spiders in a region-locked format was that it takes Frostbite and Sea Monsters off the table for you, and that was a bit too much of a commitment to get that into a lineup, which means that the power level is not what was holding this deck back, it was the power level of the lineup that you can build with it. But this weekend, that's not a problem, and I think Freljord is far and away going to be the region that is doubled up on the most, since it appears as just a splash in so many high-level decks, and none of the splashes really overlap with each other, except for Sejuani splashes. Speaking of ladder, I'm sure this is a deck that will look pretty familiar to most of you. This deck is really fast and hard to deal with. It's really just the next step in Elusive's evolution, and it's probably going to be the go-to ban if you do find yourself against an aggro lineup. I'll get into which regions can and can't be overlapped a little bit later, but for now just know that Ionia is like #1 top of the list region you can't reuse, and although Noxus has a fair bit of reuse value, it doesn't have that from one aggro deck to another. Crimson Disciple and Imperial Demolitionist are just too important for Noxus aggro to run, even though we don't see burn tools like Decimate or Noxian Fervor coming out in a deck like this. Overall, I think this deck is going to be fairly popular and paired mostly with Lucian aggro and Pilfer. And when I say Pilfer, this is what I mean. Similar to Endure Spiders, this deck is a big commitment in a region-locked lineup, but it's actually super flexible in a unified event. That's the Magic the Gathering term for no overlap between decks. I literally just looked it up. And is going to be one of the most popular decks this weekend, since the Freljord Splash only takes the Sejuani Noxus decks off the table, and none of the Bilgewater cards overlap with Sea Monsters. So your most standard lineup on the weekend is either going to be the tried and true Freljord Noxus, Sea Monsters, and Heimer Vi, or Pilfer, a Shadow Isle deck, and Heimer Vi. Now, we've seen this deck run to an amount of success even without Pilfered Goods and Black Market Merchant, and here's why. This is a Bannerman deck. This and Bannerman are the only two decks in Legends of Runeterra I would classify as tempo. They need to curve out, they're difficult to deal with when they do, and they're very consistent at doing it. That being said, the win conditions are different. Bannerman wanted to make a wide, resilient board and grind you out of resources, and this deck is just overall versatile. It can try to grind you out with advantages gained from Pilfer cards. It can level up Misfortune to take over combat. It's not uncommon to see scouts run in this deck to help enable this. Or it can level Sejuani and take over a game with a high amount of off-turn activators, since this is one of the fastest, most consistent decks for leveling her. And of course, Riptide Rex can clear out a lot of boards, as well as push through a fair amount of burn damage. While there aren't necessarily many cards in the deck that gain advantages inherently, the ones that do it so well that the deck can afford to run -1s to enable them, like Warning Shot. If we don't see the Pilfer strategy, generally it's replaced with more mid-game scouts like Island Navigator and Razorscale Hunter to gain board advantages and help accelerate the Misfortune game plan. I had briefly touched on Spooky Karma as a contender that was up and coming in the meta, and now it's here. In region-locked events, we've always seen this deck alongside Frostbite Ezreal and Misfortune Scouts, but in a unified format, Pilfer opens up as an option because there's no overlap between that and Frostbite Ezreal. It's probably the best deck in the game for throwing off inexperienced tournament players who are faced with the difficult decision of banning Ionia or banning Piltover and Zon, since they're not together in Heimer Vi here. The deck has enough removal to keep sea monsters in check and grind out Freljord Noxus decks who are going to find their Frostbite effects very ineffective. That said, Swain Sejuani does seem to be overtaking Ashe Sejuani as the Freljord Noxus deck of the format due to its versatility in dealing with non-mid-range lineups like this one. This deck can still beat Swain Sejuani. Ruination is a phenomenal tool against board-centric decks, and decks like that don't deal with Karma very well. But it's definitely not quite the counter-meta lineup that it was last weekend. Definitely keep this deck in mind when building out your lineup, and make sure that what you bring can handle either this or Frostbite Ezreal. While this deck looks a little cheeky on the surface, and on the layer below the surface, and on the one below that, and actually on the one below that too, and if you really think about it, the one below that is up for debate, and as well as, yes, it's cheesy, but cheesy isn't the same thing as bad. Nola Gold got top 4 in the BR Fest tournament I had mentioned earlier with this in his lineup. It uses very few Noxus cards, so it can fit in as a splash with either traditional burn, not elusive burn since this is still Ionia, or Freljord Noxus. Truth be told, this deck actually opens up a 3 Noxus lineup with this, Ashe Sejuani, and some kind of burn deck or Twisted Fate Swain. So if you're looking for the top tier memery this weekend, there you go. But all jokes aside, I did want to bring this deck to everyone's attention as there's a fair amount of potential for it to come out this weekend, as Lee Sin is often touted as one of the best Shadow Isle counters, and Eye of the Dragon still lets you keep up versus a lot of aggressive lineups. So the standard lineups for this weekend look a little different, both due to the format that we're in, but also because of the cracks in Demasia's armor that have begun to show in patch 1.2. So this first lineup should be the most standard lineup this weekend, picking 3 of these 5 decks with some exceptions. You can't run Freljord Noxus and Pilfer. While we've seen Frostbite Control without Sejuani in the past, she's become too important of a tool for the deck overall, and Frostbite Control is not a deck worth kneecapping to keep in your lineup. Sea Monsters and Endure Spiders probably shouldn't be run together, but if you really want to, Atrocity, Vengeance, and Vile Feast are really the only overlapping cards between the 2 decks. While Atrocity obviously does have to go into your Endure Spiders, if you want to cut, say, Vengeance from Endure Spiders and Vile Feast from Sea Monsters, it is possible to run both decks. There's really not a whole lot of overlap outside of these 3 cards, and while you will be kneecapping them a little bit, it's nowhere near as bad as something like cutting Sejuani from Frostbite Control. Spooky Karma, Frostbite Ezreal, and Pilfer is likely to be the second most popular lineup on the weekend based on previous unified event results as well as some region-locked ones, and as I mentioned, you should be testing heavily versus this lineup and making sure you can beat either the Karma or Ezreal deck. And lastly, aggro lineups have been picking up in popularity to pick on Heimerdinger Vi. While Demacia elusives have shown up a little bit, Zed Lucian Bannerman is a bit more popular of a deck and can be paired with Elusive Burn and Dealer's Choice of Endure Spiders or Pilfer, since Zed is the only Ionia card typically run in the Lucian deck. Misfortune Scouts would also fit in here if you wanted Elusive Burn and Endure Spiders, though overall I wanted to mention that while Pilfer is the biggest winner of a unified format over Region Locked, Misfortune Scouts feels like the biggest loser. In region-locked formats, because Pilfer was a large commitment on both the Freljord and Bilgewater side, we often saw Misfortune Scouts rounding out any lineup that put its Shadow Isle somewhere other than Sea Monsters. But with more regions getting cut from lineups this way, Demacia is less enticing, and Bilgewater is more highly valued due to Pilfer's overall being a stronger deck than Scouts, just not creating a more powerful lineup when in a region-locked format. Overall, what decks you want to bring and what regions you want to overlap on is completely up to you. I just kind of wanted to give a word of caution and highlight the cards that you're missing out on or that you really have to think about if you're going to double up on these regions. Number 1 is Ionia. We see Deny, Shadow Assassin, Solitary Monk, Twin Disciplines, and Will of Ionia are seen in pretty much every kind of Ionia deck, Solitary Monk being a bit of an exception, but she is seen in both Heimer Vi and the Elusive Burn decks, and I would really hate to see anyone cut any of these from either of those decks. Number 2, we have Piltover and Zon, Static Shock, Mystic Shot, Get Excited, and Thermo Beam. Thermo Beam is in pretty much any non-burn PNZ deck, and of course the other 3 are in every PNZ deck I've pretty much ever seen. And finally, Demacia. Just don't double up on Demacia. Grizzled Ranger pretty much is a must-run in any Demacia deck. You're really kneecapping yourself on already a perceivably weak region in the format by not running this if you do double up on Demacia for some reason. Before I wrap up this week, I have a special shout out I wanted to give. In a lot of card games, there's usually one outlier player who consistently brings a tier 2 or worse deck and consistently performs well but doesn't win very often. And this kind of player is usually very well received by the community for constantly shaking up the meta, but their success is hard, if not impossible, to repeat by any other player. This kind of player is a pain for someone like me, who often has a wrench thrown in an otherwise very clean data trend, though once you identify the player consistently throwing a wrench in your works, you can ignore their results as them working their outlier, unrepeatable magic. And to that effect, I want to introduce you all to Mago GX. F*** you. Mago is obviously a phenomenal player, consistently topping and consistently doing it with Karina control? Now, Mago had topped Duels of Runeterra 10 with Lux Karma, Frostbite, and Karina, and then topped the Good Day Maverick tournament running Karina, Lux Karma, and this time Pilfer. And that same weekend had topped the BR Fest tournament that I had mentioned with Heimer Vi and Karina. So you might be wondering, oh, Boulevard, you pointed out 4 cards that are very pivotal to all Piltover and Zon decks, and you were right. Well, what did they do with Karina then? They kept them in. Which means the Heimer Vi looked like this. What was this? Mago, how did you top with this? Why do you like Karina so much? And you might be wondering, oh, well, why didn't you show us the deck lists from the other tournaments? And the answer is, because I can't. Because, oops, something went wrong, which probably means that Mago set the decks to private so that they can edit them and run the same thing back this weekend. So the moral of the story is when I shit talk Karina from now on, Mago is exempt, but you are not. Don't try this one at home.